Legends and Lattes is an entirely unique piece of fantasy fiction. It is a cozy read that is perfectly summed up by its little tagline here, high fantasy, low stakes. In fact, I got to meet the author, Travis Baldree, recently at Comic-Con, and I directly asked him, what are the stakes like in this novel? And it was answered here on the cover, I just didn't know that yet. When we met, Travis explained to me that he has been a professional audiobook narrator for many years, and a lot of what he narrates is high fantasy stuff. And yet what he personally likes to read is more cozy armchair books, things that you curl up by the fireside with. And so what he did was he combined the things that he often reads for work and the things he reads for pleasure together into this, Legends and Lattes. This is a novel set in a high fantasy world full of elves, dwarves, orcs, and everything else Tolkien-esque you expect to find in high fantasy. But its protagonist, Viv, is a retired barbarian who has decided to open up her own little coffee shop. This is entirely unique in the world of fantasy fiction, but not if you turn your eye to anime and manga. There's a lot of great fantasy anime and isekai anime out there that follows similar kinds of ideas. Stories about people who have been dropped into a fantasy world, and instead of going out on a quest, they do something different. They nestle themselves into the world and bring to it something from our world. So I was familiar with the concept because I'd seen it in manga and anime, but I'd never seen it in prose before, and Travis Baldree does something absolutely wonderful here by focusing on one of my favourite things in fiction, found families. When Viv starts out, she has nothing except this stone that she managed to yank from the body of a monster that she defeated in the last big barbarian campaign that she went on. And with that stone that is supposed to bring good luck and fortune, she builds this cafe, and she recruits the help of a local handyman called Cal, who is her first friend, then a succubus who becomes her second in command at the cafe, and finally a ratkin, a small, adorable rat-like guy called Thimble, who I will do anything to protect. Thimble is absolutely wonderful. In fact, if you look at the insert here, you can see all of the characters. You've got Viv, Tandri, the succubus, and the Rat King guy down here, Thimble. And this is them working at their cafe. Viv is the owner, Tandri helps her make coffee, and Thimble comes up with brilliant recipes for pastries. This is a novel about Viv doing two things: building herself a successful cafe business, and building herself a new-found family after retiring from very bloodthirsty, dangerous, and life-threatening work as a mercenary. She is building a home for herself. That home is her livelihood. It's where she sleeps, but it's also where she builds herself a group of friends and colleagues and a small community around her. She's also bringing coffee to a city that has never heard of it before. She discovered coffee when she was traveling through the gnomish lands, and gnomes drink coffee. And so she says, ooh, this is something I can bring back to where I'm from, or at least bring to a city that doesn't have it. And so that's her first stumbling block, is actually teaching the local people what coffee is. The coffee shop takes the same name as the book, Legends and Lattes, and we watch the business grow. And we watch Viv grow as a character as she comes to deepen her bonds with all of the people around her. It's really beautifully written. Travis has a wonderful way with dialogue. I assume the fact that he's done so much audiobook narration has really helped him capture what snappy, bantery, lively, fluffy, charming language looks like amongst fantasy characters, amongst the characters in cozy reads. And he manages, as I said, to blend those two things so beautifully together. This is also a book that fantasy fans in general will get a lot out of, in spite of it not having any wars or calamities going on. It's got reference to D&D races and classes. There's actually a line in it where a character says, "I used to be an adventurer like you," which any gamer in the world, especially anyone who's played Skyrim, will know the reference to. It's a cheeky thing to put in, but I laughed. But it's lovely to find a piece of fantasy fiction that doesn't deal with big grand adventures and world-ending catastrophes, politics and religion, and there's always war. I said this to Travis when I met him. You read a fantasy book, and the word war will be in the blurb. There's always a war. There's no war here, and that's lovely. There is, however, a kind of local mafia that Viv ends up getting wrangled into, and so there are some stakes. There is a threat that she must deal with. But again, it's small, it's intimate, it's minor, it's not a grand global thing. I remember thinking about this years ago, the idea of writing fantasy books that are only fantasy in their setting and their tropes. But instead, maybe your fantasy novel follows a journalist in a fantasy world, or a mailman. And I know Terry Pratchett has done stuff like this, and I really appreciate that, but his books are specifically satirical and comedic, whereas just following the life of a journalist in a fantasy world would be a really, really fun novel. Maybe I should write that. But Travis has done it here with a local business, and a protagonist who does know the stories and the dangers and the life of a hero. A murderous, dangerous, powerful person. And yet she's chosen to hang up her sword and do something nicer. What will really carry you through this book is the relationships. Thimble the Ratkin is an absolutely darling little guy. I love him so much. He can barely speak. He makes incredible pastries. He's addicted to coffee. He's the most charming little thing in the world, and I will do anything for him. But the relationship that builds between Viv and Tandri, our two protagonists, is just so heartwarming. It brings tears to my eyes just thinking about the tiny journeys that they go on as they get to know each other better. Oh, it's delightful. This is a really wholesome, lovely read. It's the kind of thing that the fantasy genre really needed, and I'm so glad that Travis Baldree has brought it to us. If you love fantasy books, if you love the idea of a cozy read that's going to make you just feel warm inside, but it's set in a fantasy world, you need to read Legends and Lattes. Check it out, and subscribe for books.